Okay, my name's Jim Fryer, and I'm with the Hall & Hall Management Group, and I'm here today sitting with Brent Marsh, also part of our ranch management group, and also Race King of the Matador Cattle Ranch and Cattle Company. And we're going to talk about kind of the operation that Race is overseeing here these days, and he's had several years of experience here and kind of seen it evolve over the past decade and a half, I believe, from kind of a traditional cattle ranch type operation into more of a grazing piece today.
So I guess my question is, when you first came on, what did the ranch look like? What was the traditional operation day to day in, seasonally?
So I think it was a lot, like is common, especially in those days, where it was pretty typical for commercial cow operation to calve in March and April, and had some public land obviously and private, summer grazing, and come home and sell calves in the fall and feed hay for the majority of the winter.
What was it that kind of drove you to that change?
And the owner at the time was really driving the change. Number one, economically. Coming from a strong, traditional business background, he just looked at it and said, this, is not sustainable financially for me. So we have to make some pretty big changes to do that. And, and to be honest, he looked at his balance sheet and, picked out feed costs and labor and equipment, kind of those big things that stand out to a lot of people. And he literally just said, let's cut them out. And of course, we felt like that's pretty naive to be able to kind of do that. But at the same time, that was the driver. And so we started trying to look at ways where we could, do what we needed to do and have enough production, but where we could kind of cut some costs.
So I guess what was the transition into this kind of, what got you into it and actually on your feet?
So really, I had come from a desert operation that I grew up on in southeastern Utah. And obviously, we had wintered cows out, and it's pretty typical for the cows to graze year round, but in a whole different environment. Mm-hmm. Wasn't really sure how those things might, cross over, this far north. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we knew we could make some improvement there, and we largely looked at things that, could cut our costs. And we really, at the time, we really had no control over markets. We have, little control over them today. But we can control where we spend our money and how, and to some degree. And so we started to focus on the things that that we could control. And obviously, the key to that for us was backing our calving dates up some more, and that allowed us to, have a dry cow through the winter that could maintain body weight on some low quality and dormant feed, and then started looking at ways to stockpile winter feed. And what did that look like? What type of range or pasture was that really could handle a foot of snow at times and still allow those cows? And so, we learned a lot, right?
Yeah.
And but that was key. That really drove everything else. And then as we kind of started making some, I guess having a little success with those changes we've made, then it kind of opened up this other enterprise opportunity for us on this traditional hay base. Now we could look at ways to delve into some markets that maybe we had a little more control over what that product was worth. And
what were some of those markets that you dove into?
So once again, we'll go back to ownership. They drove that as well, and they were very interested in the natural and non-hormone treated kind of value-added type programs, and that was really their passion. So that we tried to make some of those changes, and once again, ownership was willing to take a little risk on that to develop some markets, but didn't want to throw away money operationally on things that didn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. And so then one of the metrics that you might measure, is it like a feed to weaned pounds or beef produced or some kind of metric like that where you can evaluate how you're doing on that high feed cost?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it was really maybe even a little deeper than that, was trying to figure out what class of animal could handle higher cost feed. Does that make sense? And I think once we realized that, it's okay to put a little bit of feed into a calf, that pound is worth something, versus maybe an old cow where it's discounted.
Right. You have to match the marketable animal
Exactly.
into the
And obviously
best.
costs of production are important, but for us, it was maybe taking another step and trying to identify that, gosh, this is actually a class of animals that gives us more opportunity, and maybe it doesn't take as many pounds of feed to put a pound of gain on, and maybe that pound of gain is worth even a little bit more. Even within this ranch, we have land and certain resources that's more suitable for a cow-calf operation. Might have lower quality feed, and maybe water's a little more sparse, right? Not as plentiful. Obviously, we focus lower production, lower quality type scenarios for our cow-calf operation. But when we get into higher quality and maybe even higher cost forages, the lighter cattle really pay off. And so, obviously, just from a trend, we can run more of them per acre, per section, and we're paid better for them.
Like you said, there's different areas where you're running the cow calves, and there's different areas where you're running these lighter calves. Do you take them to yearlings?
Yes.
Take them to yearlings, and then are you running them here on the irrigated ground, or are
Yeah, and we've done a little of both, where we run, primarily on the irrigated ground with the stockers, but we've also ran them in, some higher mountain type country.
Gotcha. I guess what were some of the approaches you took? Because were they really running cattle on the pivots when you first got here, or was it
No.
just hay base?
It was-
So what was kind of the approaches and I guess different styles you had to work at when you started, developing these as pastures instead of a hay base?
I guess first of all, we had to figure out how to graze those pivots so we could really be, efficient with them, right? And, I think honestly, the biggest thing that we had to learn, we can talk about cattle and classes and all this, but we really didn't start making a lot of progress till we started thinking about soil health. And as we start utilizing livestock to really enhance that, and started to really get a little bit of passion for soil health, a lot of these other economic things kind of fixed themselves, because we were able to lower some input and then increase production, and really the tweaking became between these different operations. So we did some grass finishing. We didn't do that forever, but I'm so grateful that we were challenged with that. It was not something I was really excited to want to take on. Even though I may not have had those ideas initially, it was exciting. And if we look back 10 years even, or look through the first 10 years, I'm so grateful we had those challenges to do the grass finishing. I'm not saying we would never do it again, because we might. But what we learned was we had to be better managers. And as we started working through the niche markets and didn't have as many products to just help us treat symptoms on the land and do these different things, because of cost and the programs we're involved in, we had to start becoming a little bit better managing. And as we did that, to make cattle that were growing and finishing and really producing well enough on forage, we only did that because we became a little bit better managers and tried to tweak that over time. And so we analyzed our enterprises and eventually kind of went away from that, because these lighter cattle return more dollars for us, because we could turn them over quicker and turn over different, groups of them and get paid a little more per pound. But, once again, everybody's situation's different, and how do you get paid and where your value is unique to every operation. Even, I don't think you have to go that other valley, or we don't have to go too far. We can go right across the fence. And everybody's resources and talents and passions kind of play into all of that.
So I think that's a great a great story about the grass-fed beef. And I mean, that's just a clear example of doing your homework and having that experience. You know, you probably wouldn't know the things you know today about grazing cattle in this environment on the grass unless you went through that. But can you give us a bit more flavor on, you know, digging into the things you learned and, you know, the reasons you went into this path?
It's the soil that makes all of this work. And I think it's taken me a lot of years, and we definitely have ownership that understands that, both past and present. And so it's a big part of our goal to make progress. And, you know, I mean, we look at the kind of the old school stuff. I mean, when we start talking about carbon, I mean, it's kind of organic matter is how we measure that today. And, you know, the increases that we've seen with maybe bringing back and utilizing livestock, you know, kind of the new age grazing, if you will, and maybe the regenerative term or whatever term you want to use, something to help us step forward and continually enhance our soil's health. We're going to take over 360 soil samples across the ranch this summer to start really scientifically, you know, measuring what's really happening. You know, we don't know what that's going to do from a carbon markets and things like that. That is not our motivation. Our motivation is to improve soil health. Maybe the biggest benefit from soil health for us was evident last year. What we found out is we were a little bit more drought resilient than the properties around us. Mm-hmm. And I think we held up a little bit better, you know, and, you know, dramatically in some cases. And I think that opens their eyes, you know. So we don't have to look at carbon markets and things like that to get paid for doing that. I mean, if we can utilize more of what rain, you know, falls and get every bit of that, you know, into our soil and being productive for us, that's payback enough. But I think as the more we learn, right, and I think had a previous employer, and maybe the best thing I learned from him is that we always need to be students, right? And it's not always about what you know and where you've been, but are you willing to adapt and change, and are you interested in becoming a little bit better every day? And most people in this industry, through ownership and management, have, you know, have kind of committed to continually learning. Mm-hmm. And if they're not, they probably won't be around too long or own a place too long if they're an owner, or managing, we probably won't be around very long if we think that what we've done in the past 20 years is going to answer all the challenges we have in our future.
Well, thank you, Race. Great points. Now let's go out and see it. Thank you.
That's always better. Let's go look at it. So we're out in one of our irrigated pastures. We're standing here, and you know, this is actually a pasture that is irrigated by hand lines. So one question we get from a lot of folks is, gosh, what kind of irrigation systems do we need, and what should we be focusing on? And once again, you know, we've kind of worked with hand lines and wheel lines, and yeah, we have a lot of pivots, but all of these systems work. We're standing on a field that this is, what is it today? The August 9th. And this is the third time this pasture's been grazed, or at least this cell, over the summer. And we've probably had, I don't know exactly here just because we're not driving, but we've probably had somewhere between 25 and 30 days of rest since it was last grazed on what you're looking at. So, you know, not too long, but enough that we've got really good quality pasture for a set of what we started out with as some lighter stalker heifers that we're trying to put quite a lot of gain on. Maybe what we'll try to address here as we're standing out here is maybe some of the misconceptions that people sometimes have as we start talking about intense grazing, whatever term you want to talk about. You know, whether it's managed intensive grazing or rotational grazing, but when we're talking about high stocking densities for short durations and using some form of or electric fence, you know, one of the first things is people will say, gosh, it's got to be intense labor to be able to, you know, put up and tear down fence. You know, I've had other people say it's intense stupidity, right? You know, you guys are crazy for doing this, right? But I really think the intensity comes in managing. And we don't find that the labor is anywhere near what it would be to harvest this, and put it into bales, whether it's round bale or square bales. So we think we've lowered the labor intensity by a lot. Once again, these cows kind of become our harvesters, and we let them do a little more of the work. But what you do when you have cattle in a shorter, a smaller pasture with higher density, if you're off with your projection of how much forage they need, you can be off a couple hours and there's an impact, right? It's not like in a giant pasture where you have days and days and months you might be grazing. You can be off a little bit there and not see maybe an immediate impact, where here you can be. And so one of the things that's real easy to do, you can't see it right now, but these heifers are getting ready to rotate where we're standing, and they're moving this direction as we graze. We always have the next day's pasture set up for them. And these heifers will rotate pasture every day. But we always look at the current size of the paddock we're using and estimate how much we need tomorrow. And we can literally look at the grass and make a measurement, or at least take a visual measurement and say, okay, that was perfect, that we reached our goals, or yeah, we took a little too much, or maybe we could graze that a little harder. And what we're able to do with the portable electric fencing is to make that paddock a little bigger, a little smaller, make those adjustments. So I guess the question is, what's your expectation? What should we expect as we start to transition from maybe a hay field into a pasture? And I think one of the first things that you're going to have to notice is when we look at a typical hay field, we get a lot of height in production, but as we get down around the roots, we don't have as much of a canopy cover, right? It'll look really tall and can look very productive. And so as we start grazing these pastures with livestock, what we start doing is kind of allowing those plants to kind of stool out a little more, if you will. They'll, with the hooves walking on it, maybe some of the characteristics of those plants change a little bit on how they're out. We get a little more ground cover, and we get a little more dense production. And so that's maybe a visual answer to the question what to expect. What happens to these animals, or what grasses do they maybe favor, and what does that do as they're grazing to the longevity of this stand of pasture grass? And so as we look at the heifers, you can see that even from this area that there's certain plants that they've focused in on and grazed a little shorter than others, okay? The goal of intensive grazing is to, at some point while they're in that pasture, kind of force them to eat all the different plants at the same rate. And there's still gonna be some selecting of their most palatable grass, or what, at that time of year, what's the most flavorful for them. Much like when I walk into a buffet, I start on, the end of the buffet that's the most appealing to me. And sometimes if my wife's with me, she makes me start at the other end. And so I think it's a little different, but cattle are much like that. And I think, but the goal of this is really to probably have some uniform grazing, and at the same time, not have any of those plants that we've overgrazed, or maybe in this case taken below 3 or 4 inches of growth, and that'll allow those plants to come back. The real key to all this is not what grass you have or what your target grazing heights are or where you quit grazing. It's, do you provide adequate rest between grazing? And so the real goal and benefit to intensive grazing is to increase the rest periods, at least to the point that those plants are recovered. And so as we do that, all of these grasses will thrive. Not just, the biggest, hardiest grass that maybe they don't favor as well, right? In a season-long grazing, they keep nibbling back and grazing regrowth on maybe the most palative species, and that's the grass that maybe gets somewhat suppressed. And then maybe the grasses that don't have as much palatability, they get rank and and they're the ones that make seed, and they're the ones that thrive in your system. I tell people all the time, I'm not a great grass species guy. If it's productive and persistent, that's what I want. And I think that every one of us, if you're looking at a pasture and you're in another state, you're across the valley, another country, that's it. You really need to focus on things that are working in your area. And I say that all the time. I want grass that's productive and persistent in my area, and I'll learn to manage it. Some grasses need to be grazed a little shorter, not have as much maturity. Others need a little more maturity. This pasture we're standing in, I don't have it dialed down to the exact years, but I know it's been over 20 years since this ground's been tilled and touched. And that's on this half of it. And on the other half, we broke it up about 10, 12 years ago because we thought we wanted more production. And we just realized that the livestock, and as we increased some organic matter and did things, there is no difference in the two halves. We can't see any forage improvement from that. We did initially, while we had cover crops and different things in it and did some things, but we got into the system and got into when we were really grazing this new seeding, and the old half outproduced it for quite a few years. It took many years to come back. And as we learn about how we lose organic matter and how tillage affects that, and at the same time, I think our grazing management got better, and we started allowing these animals to help us that much more. We were building stronger biology, and we were enhancing our soil's health. And we've been able to keep the tractors out of it. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, soil health, maybe a little more scientific. And once again, I'm not a soil nerd. I'm trying to be. I know it's super important for me. There's so many people that are way smarter than me. But I do come out here every day and I look at pasture, and I can really see what's happening above the ground. And I can tell you, once we learned that we have to leave more residual, there's a lot of positive things happen for us. We're still getting a lot of impact with our livestock, but leaving enough canopy really helps us, first of all, keep that solar panel working, right? So we can capture sunlight. It also can keep soil temperatures a little lower. That soil, if it's bare, is hotter. We know we can keep it cooler, and we can be more efficient with our irrigation and our soil moisture. Capturing, water is one thing, right? It's a big thing, but we often talk about on a range, it's not how much rain you get, it's how much you're able to put in the soil and keep in the soil. And this is where we're really seeing the benefits below the ground. The biology is increasing. We've got more life down there. We've got more bugs and all of those things. But as we look at the soil profile, it's cooler, it's richer, it's more resilient. And so obviously the big effects, once again, I encourage people to get smarter about soil than I am and learn to make it fun, but what's happening below the surface is more important than what we're seeing above. But we spend all of our time reacting to what's happening above ground. We got talking about carbon sequestering. In order to sequester carbon, you've got to have a green growing plant. A big rank dormant grass that's big and pretty doesn't do anything. Why it's so important to have the livestock part of it. You've got to have that regrazing and management where you're keeping it growing. So if we can manage this and keep this green leaf continuing to grow, that's important, right? If we just let it get up and start to mature and seed out, and we're not sequestering much. And that's all part of this whole beautiful cycle. The other thing that's really beautiful about this cycle, what percent of the nutrition value in the grass that goes through the mouth of those cows do you think is coming back to the land? A very high percentage of that nutritional value can be put back and utilized. And if it just dries out, we lose it again, right? But it's hitting this ground. We're looking down. If you had a camera and you were looking down at this grass, this was grazed 25 days ago, approximately. We cannot find a manure pad. We're not out here with a tractor harrowing that in. The biology and the grass and all of this is working, right? And those insects and all this whole process is utilizing it. And so I think it's beautiful. So how do we make up the difference of what those cows are consuming? And that's where the big question is. If we're not grazing as good, we got to use, we're doing more of a traditional grazing, we're probably going to have more inputs with fertilizer. We're going to have to put those back. We obviously, solar, right? We're going to pull some energy out of the sky and the sun. We're, hopefully going to sequester some carbon, right? And so if we can enhance, as we get better at our grazing, and as we get better at managing that, we start limiting the gap of those inputs. How do you balance, what we're doing from a production agriculture scenario to maybe the recreation side and wildlife and what maybe a herd of elk might do. And, and we do struggle with that a little bit. And, when our stuff gets out of balance and our wildlife populations get extreme, we can really struggle with that. But, everything we're doing here is benefiting the wildlife. I guess I would ask the question to most people, where do you think the elk, when they come down and want to come into these pivots, where do they graze? They don't graze in front of these cows. They graze behind them. They'd rather graze the regrowth. And so there is some challenges, right, with that. But they're pretty mobile. And as long as we can keep numbers in balance and realize that, if that's an important part of your operation, they're going to need some resources, I guess that's okay. But you got to have a plan to how to keep that in balance and make sure that, your numbers don't get too out of whack. One thing I will say is that our elk will train to electric fence. Early on, we'd putting up fence all the time, and they respect it. If you have a little bit of diligence, and so there's some ways that we can do some fencing and make some of that work. So I don't know how to answer all the solutions. I guess there's obviously a lot of value to have wildlife on our land. We want a balance, and we want everything from insects to the elk and moose and even foxes and coyotes and all, these other predator type animals. We realize we need some of them around. If we don't have foxes and coyotes out here, we have ground squirrels overrun us. And, we need some things, and I think we just have to take a little more of a holistic approach to this. And it's not an easy answer, but we're able to work in harmony. And I think that's the answer we've come up with. Now that you're in this intensive grazing and rolling, the comment was, this looks like a fairly clean pasture, at this point. What are you doing? And I'm going to tell you that our attitude towards weeds and our mindset has changed 180 degrees, I guess. And I think our attitude really changed because I think so much of the time we think of weeds and we think they're the problems, and they're really a symptom. And we spend all our time trying to really manage with chemicals a symptom, right? And one of the things that we had to realize, let's look on the ground, and you see these plants here, what is this? A lot of people would tell us we need to spray it out. It's a dandelion, okay? It's pretty productive, the cattle love it. 15 years ago, I'd have been tempted to just come in with some 2,4-D or something and get rid of it. And what we realized that, it's a really important part of the puzzle. One thing I've learned from our tours, when we get folks from other countries, like Australia, they look and pick it up and they tell us it looks like stuff that they plant. And, I can tell you those cows' favorite, it's very little of that is left because they love it, and it's producing, right? And it's adding some diversity to these plants. And so it's important. But one thing that we have noticed is that we've all, let's be honest, on all of our ranchers, all our ranches, if you're a rancher and you've really managed it, and we have livestock, we've always got a group of livestock that are maybe needing to heal up, okay? We've got some calves that, we've got to have gone through some struggles, maybe with some things that we're trying to heal them up. And we end up having a pasture that is somewhat a hospital, if you will, where, got some cows that are recovering. And so because of that, we don't do this in daily intensive moves because we're trying to heal them up. Guess where our weeds are? We have weeds that'll pop up just like that. And they would happen here if we start season grazing. And we do have them, well, I'll be honest, right on our fence lines where we're not able to graze them. One thing about these plants, a lot of our attitude changes because if they have nutrition value, they're productive, the cows will eat them. Are they really a weed, right? And some of these plants, as they start being grazed and are in that process, they find out they're not very resilient, a lot of those plants. And so they just kind of quit seeing them. Some of the other plants that are kind of truly big, noxious, thistly kind of plants, they're kind of coarse and stemmy. They don't like being stepped on. So even though the cattle don't graze them, that foot traffic and that compression really kind of puts them out. But I think we can come out here and change our management in 1 year and go back to a kind of traditional seasonal long type scenario. And we'll see all those weeds that you don't think are here. But once again, I think we can use our grazing management to really answer the problem instead of just treating symptoms. There's still so much to learn. And I think that's what's beautiful about my job. I'm excited to try to be a little better at this next year than I am today. And that's fun for me.